Hey everyone, welcome back to Reading with Tatiana. Today I'm filming in hopefully the last week that we're staying in this basement suite, so excuse the mess, but there are tons of books here, so I thought it'd be a little different background. So today my book review is on The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon, and I gave this book a 4 out of 5. Before I start my review, I do want to say that I really enjoyed this book because I felt there were a few twists and a few turns that I didn't expect, and I feel like everyone should really experience this book. It is quite a short read and pretty easy to go through if you have a few days or a clear weekend to do it. So before I start my review, I will say that this review is spoiler free, or at least very, very, very minor spoilers. So if you haven't read it yet, this video is for you. If you have read it, watch it anyways and let me know what you think about the book. And also, before I get into my review, as always, please hit the subscribe button. If you like the content, please give a thumbs up. And if you have any comments for me on how I can make my videos better, or if you've read this book and you have a comment, leave it down below as well. And I always look forward to interacting with you guys. Before I go into the full review, I always like to start talking about a bit about the author Mark Haddon. So he is born in the 1960s in England, which is actually very similar to the previous book I reviewed, Toby Young. And he actually wrote this book intended for an adult audience, but when he went to his publishers, they actually said that it'd be a good book for adults and for children as well, which I thought was pretty interesting. This book that he wrote is actually, I think, his biggest novel or collection. He's written quite a bit, but this one won a bunch of awards. So I have it listed here. It's won the Whitbread Book of the Year, the Commonwealth Writers Prize, the Guardian Children's Fiction Prize, and a Man Booker Prize. Of course, none of these awards mean anything to me, but I feel like if you're in the book or writing community, it's very amazing that you won all these awards for a book that you've written. So good job, Mark. A fun fact I found about Mark is that not only is he an avid writer, but he's also an avid artist. And I always love looking at art, so I'll pop up some of his art pieces here. He does a mix of mixed mediums, and he does obviously some abstract art, but he also does portraits, I think, of people in his life. And he also does illustrations for one of his books called The Pier Falls. And The Pier Falls is a collection of short stories. And here are some illustrations that he has in the collection. I'm definitely going to add this book to my to-be read list just because I love short stories. And last year when I read Ted Chiang's collection of short stories called Exhalation, that really inspired me to delve into exploring the idea of writing. I am no means a writer at all, but that book really inspired me to start writing just because even though I read a lot of novels, a short story is amazing because you can say so much in so little words, and you can build these universes and worlds, and that's really amazing to me. I just want to share his collection of short stories called The Pier Falls because I think it seems like a really great read. So some of the short stories is on the website. It says the first one is an expedition to Mars that goes wrong. The second one is a seaside pier collapses, which is why probably the book is called The Pier Falls. There is a short story that talks about a 30-stone man. So I think one stone in the UK is around 14 pounds. So a very big guy who is confined to his living room. There's another short story that talks about two boys who discover a gun in a shoebox, and then also a short story about a man who shoots a stranger in the chest on Christmas Eve. So it's pretty cool because not only did he write this collection of short stories, but he also did a bunch of illustrations as well. I'm going to start talking a bit about the story and the setting of the book. So as I said before, it's interesting because when Mark wrote this novel, he intended for an adult audience, but his publisher said that it'll be good for children and adults. And now having read the book, I definitely agree with that. I think it definitely should be part of high school curriculum because I think at a very early age, it will expose you to different perspectives, especially if your school that you attend in high school also has programs to support autistic kids or kids that have different developmental abilities. So the book starts with Christopher, our main character. He is 15 years old, and he finds his neighbor's dog murdered. And we know the dog is murdered and not just died of natural causes because there's a garden fork through his body. So obviously someone intentionally tried to kill the dog. So Christopher, he is on the hunt to find out who the murderer is. And this is why the book, I think, sells or kind of comes off as a murder mystery. And so he starts asking his neighbors and also digging around his home to find clues on who was the dog's murderer. And his dad tells him to stick out of it. So that's kind of like interesting. Like, oh, why would his dad say, Christopher, don't do it? So throughout the story, as Christopher tries to discover who or uncover who the murderer is, he, as an autistic child or teenager, has to step outside of his comfort zone because he has to talk to people. He has to, maybe touch things he's not really comfortable touching and be in situations that he's not really comfortable normally being into. So it's pretty cool to see how he interacts with the world because he has this goal of trying to find out who the murderer is. I'm going to go over the characters now. So the first character is obviously our protagonist, who also, the novel is written from his perspective. So his name is Christopher. As I said, he's also a 15-year-old boy. He goes to a special school. Even though I don't think he's aware of it so explicitly, it's very clear the way he describes his fellow classmates that clearly they all have different developmental abilities. So even though he is on the spectrum and being autistic, he is very clever at math. And he's actually due to write his A-levels, which are exams that you write in the UK to get into university. So math, I think, is something that he's naturally very good at, and it's also what grounds him. So throughout the novel, when he gets into different adventures or mishaps and he's overwhelmed, he'll always think about math or certain formulas or his favorite prime numbers, which kind of give him like solace and some sense of relief. So he doesn't like to be touched. He doesn't like crowds. He only eats red things, and I believe he hates the color yellow and brown, if I remember correctly. And he obviously never says explicitly that he's autistic, but you can tell by the way he engages and reacts with his world that he clearly is on the spectrum. So I thought that was really cool how the author used that tool for us as reader to discover that very quickly, very early on. The second main character is his dad. We learned that his dad is his primary caregiver because a few years ago, Christopher's mom had passed away, and we understand that his dad is a great caregiver. There's this thing where Christopher doesn't like to be touched, as I shared earlier, so the only way his dad can show him affection or that he's there for him is he'll spread his hands like a fan, and they would touch fingers like this. So in the book, there's situations where, in the beginning, where his dad tries to communicate with him, and he's very respectful. He knows all of Christopher's boundaries and what things trigger him and what things make him comfortable again. And he really believes in Christopher's capabilities to be good in math, so he goes out of his way to schedule an A-levels exam just so Christopher can go to university. I mentioned earlier that his mom has passed away a few years ago. So in the book, from Christopher's perspective, we learned that a few years ago she had a heart attack. She was in the hospital for a few weeks. Unfortunately, Christopher was never able to visit her in the hospital. So yeah, that's basically her, and that's why her dad is Christopher's primary caregiver. The other main character I would like to mention is Mrs. Shears, who is their neighbor's dog that was murdered. The dog's name was Wellington. And why she's a main character as well is because since her husband, Mr. Shears, or ex-husband, left a few years ago, and Mr. Shears is the primary suspect because for Christopher, the only person that would want to hurt Mrs. Shears by hurting her dog would be Mr. Shears, who have a motive. So that's why she's important to the novel, because she is a link to the primary suspect, Mr. Shears. And also Mrs. Shears, since her husband left her, over the years has started to come visit Christopher's dad and helps out around the house, also makes dinner and sometimes stays over as well. From Christopher's perspective, it just seems like she's a friend that comes over and stays over sometimes, but from a reader's perspective, it's very clear that Mrs. Shears and the father have some sort of romantic relationship happening. I lied. There's one more main character I'd like to share, which I'm going to say wrong, but it's Siobhan, which I believe is an Irish name, and I think it's pronounced Shebin or Siobhan. Correct me if I'm wrong, totally saying it wrong. But she is Christopher's teacher, and she's important because she is the one that actually tells Christopher to write his experience about trying to solve the murder of Wellington. So this book is kind of like the product of which she prompts him to write. And she also helps with finding ways for him to calm down and to ground himself whenever he's feeling panicky. And also throughout the book, we see tips she gives him in the past to deal with people in crowds and strangers. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it a 4 out of 5. So there's really only one thing I didn't like about it, which wouldn't be the case for a lot of people, but for me it was. And that was there was quite a bit of math in this book throughout, because there's tons of time in a novel where Christopher gets overwhelmed and he thinks about math. And I think Mark Haddon wants to portray what he's going through. But to be honest, I just kind of skip over the math problem. So you can see here, there's like some complicated math. So I kind of just skipped through the math problems. I didn't try to figure it out or solve it. Hopefully they were just visual and just an example of what Christopher's experiencing, because if the math problems added to the plot, I missed all of them. There were a couple of things I liked in the book, and the first one for me for sure is because the book is written from Christopher's perspective as an autistic person, is that it's interesting to see how his mind spirals in certain situations and how he will really focus on one thing and he can't get out of it. So an example is in the book, he gets really overwhelmed by how crowded a subway is. So that's all he can focus on, and it really debilitates him. And obviously autism is a development disability and not a mental disorder, but the way in the book when he talks about his spiraling and focusing on things and he can't get out of that like mindset really reminds me when I experience anxiety and I'm really focused on one thing and I can't get out of it. So I really like that perspective throughout the book, as I feel if people who are autistic read this book, or maybe people who experience anxiety like me, it makes me feel really like seen and that someone else also experiences this as well. To add to that point, I also really enjoyed how when Christopher goes about in the world and tries to navigate things like a train station and that kind of stuff, it's amazing to me how much he struggles with and how much like me or you don't struggle with it. And this book, what I really like is it really shows how it's amazing how we function every day, because our world is so modernized and so connected that you can cross the street and like, oh, I'm just crossing the street, but there's literally like a million things are happening that your brain is intaking and processing. That's very automatic for us, but it isn't necessarily automatic or automated by our brain for someone who is on the spectrum. So I really liked how the book really showed you the difference very clearly between people that are typical and atypical. Another thing I really enjoy in the book is, as the book is told in Christopher's perspective, we see the adults in his life engaging with him. And I really like how the book shared that, you know, even though he's a child and these are adults, it's not like these adults know everything and they're not perfect. And I really like how all the adults in his life were just doing their best to help him or to protect him. But even though their best isn't the right thing sometimes. So I really like how it really showed that adults don't know everything and how they're humans too. So I really like how the book showed that very clearly with Christopher and the adults in his life. On Goodreads, this book got an average of 3.89 stars, and it was a mix of reviews, but I would say that heavily out of, I think it was like a 40,000 reviews since this book came out. Most of the reviews were 5s across the board and like a bunch of ones that are 1 or 2s. Lots of 3 and 4s, but I was really surprised by how many 5-star reviews there were. So I'm kind of surprised that the average is 3.89, because based on what I saw, it seemed like it skewed heavier on the 5 side. So a lot of people enjoyed the book, which I already said already, so I feel like I'm a broken record. But basically, a lot of people said that this book made us as a reader really aware of how tough our world can be and how we're so privileged that society is so automated for us as someone who is typical. And you know, we can really take for granted that we're able to just do things so seamlessly, where the person on the spectrum who is autistic may have a hard time navigating, but it doesn't mean they're wrong. It just means the world wasn't really built with them in mind. So I really enjoyed that, and lots of people also agreed with me as well. Reviews that I saw that were bad were mostly because they were readers who have autistic children themselves, and it felt that it portrayed autism very poorly. As someone who is not autistic and as someone that's never had a direct experience with someone autistic, I can't really speak on that. So I definitely would take those reviews with the opposite of a grain of salt, which I would take them and consider that because they actually have real life experience with autism. So I think those bad reviews are very valid. Some other bad reviews I saw, which I would actually agree with, was the book I think was sold or came off as a murder mystery, but as the plot develops very quickly, you realize it isn't a murder mystery. So I can see and agree with the disappointment in that, but that doesn't really take away from being a bad book overall. But I guess it is a bad murder mystery. Reasons why I think you should read this book. The number one reason for me is if you've watched a show on Netflix called Love is on the Spectrum, you would love this book too, because it's reading something that's not in your gut perspective and just opening your mindset and your eyes on how others may perceive the world, I think is always really important. So if you want to read something and that will make you think differently, then this is the book that you should definitely read. Other reason you should read this book, maybe not a good reason for lots of people, but it's also on BBC's 100 books you should read before you die. So it's kind of cool because on that list of 100, it's mostly like older books from like the 1900s earlier. The Bible is on there, so it's kind of cool that there's a modern book that made that list. So yeah, that is one reason why I think you should read it, because it's probably one of the easier and shorter reads on the top 100 list by BBC. So you can say you read a top 100 book recommended by them. As always, I like to share how a book made me feel, because as I always say, if you ask me a year from now or 5 years from now, I won't remember the characters, I won't remember the plot, I won't really remember what happened in the book, but I'll always remember how a book made me feel. So this book, The Curious Incident of a Dog in Nighttime by Mark Haddon, it made me feel hopeful. So why I picked the word hopeful is I feel this book is not just the story, but I feel like it is giving me hope that there's a way to convey how people think differently and perceive the world differently than us, and it kind of bridges the gap between me and an autistic person. And I feel that this is actually one of those books that I think should be part of high school curriculum, because when I was younger and had no exposure to people with different development capabilities, I may think or react kind of like off-putting, or I'm not familiar, so it's scary to me, which is obviously not the right reaction, but as a young person, as a child, I wouldn't know how else to react. So I feel like this book is really important to give people a different perspective, and yeah, this book just made me feel hopeful about humanity and about life. So if you read this book, tell me what you think in the comments down below. Let me know if you want to add it to your to-be-read list after this review. And if you want to join me in my next review, the next book I'm reading right now is by Tina Fey, and it's called Bossypants. I already started it, and it's a pretty easy read. It kind of feels like I'm listening to a podcast or an interview, and she's in the room with me, and it seems pretty funny so far. So if you like biographies, if you like Tina Fey, I definitely recommend this book. Alright, see you next time. Bye.